Howdy y'all, and welcome to my final research presentation. It concludes a full year as a Olson Scholar at American University, and I've titled my paper and thus this presentation, The Ontology of Democratic Jazz, Race, Freedom, and Cold War Diplomacy. Thank you for joining me as I walk through the joy of research. Here's some historical context. The United States was confronted with an unfamiliar dilemma following the end of World War II. It could not continue to serve as a democratic model for the rest of the world while remaining uninvolved with the world's affairs. This national effort to intimidate, overpower, and outperform the Soviet Union was unlike any previous conflict the United States had participated in because it introduced cultural diplomacy as a means of capturing the hearts and minds of potential ally states through merchandising American soft power. Musical acts historically dominated American cultural diplomacy, but American classical music, the most common genre showcased abroad, received a relatively indifferent response from its host countries. Jazz, however, forged by African Americans in Harlem during the early 20th century, was the first original genre of music completely crafted within the United States, making it an ideal cultural product for export. After reading scholarly literature and historical articles and books surrounding my research project, I created this research statement. It guides my research as I progress. I proceed to analyze the media discourse on democratic jazz between the years 1955 and 1991 through an interpretivist lens because I want to characterize the media's framing of jazz as democratic during the Cold War. The academic conversation surrounding scholarly literature and research puzzles like mine can be divided into three conceptual groupings: the jazzocracy illustration, the jazzarchy illustration, and the critical realist illustration. Two offer unique explanations for the waxing and waning of jazz's democratic portrayal. Those are the first two. And the third school of thought illuminates the processes behind the meaning making of words like democratic through analyzing the causal pathways by which definitions are created. I am positioning myself as a theoretical mediator between these three explanations, bridging the gap between Cold War history and international studies research and arbitrating a historically sincere assessment of the nature of democratic jazz. Over the course of my research, I had to make a variety of decisions. But foremost, I made the decision of analyzing the media discourse of surrounding the democratic portrayal of jazz through an interpretivist lens because jazz, much like the media discourse surrounding it, was co-generated. Within the broader decision of basing my research on interpretivist methodology, I elect to employ discourse analysis as my means of examining the evolving depiction of jazz as inherently tied to American liberal values. Additionally, I'm choosing to only consider Western sources that were published between 1955 and 1991. From there, I researched ProQuest news and newspapers for all articles containing the word jazz within 10 words of democracy, democratic, democratizing, etc., and the mention of experts on jazz diplomacy, the six listed in front of you. The inclusion of the expert hopes to create a collection of every instance of Western media sources authoring a meaningful representation of jazz as democratic, not just any. And after combing through the resulting articles, I found 30 cases of such. Here's 4 examples. As you can see from left to right, you have the article title, the author name, the year of publication, and the meaning of democracy, which I coded. So the 4 meanings are freedom of expression, racial diversity, being part of a whole, and simply American. And after carefully analyzing the meanings used in each article, I labeled them and their publication year to create a use over time stacked histogram. After organizing the results, I created this. On the bottom, you'll notice 5-year bin widths for each of the bins between 1955 and 1991, and a legend to track the meanings over time. They're coordinated by color. So this map of usage of democracy tells me a lot, but I've arranged that information into 6 key findings. Here they are. 1. Jazz was most called democratic during the discourse's first and last 5 years, 9 times each. 2nd, democratic no longer represented racial diversity after the civil rights movement. That's the green one. You can see the dip, and it never appears again. Number 3, freedom of expression dominated the meaning of democracy near the end of the Cold War. Number 4, balancing one's own self-identity with their groups as a meaning of democracy, and that's the being part of a whole, developed midway through the Cold War, so it's a brand new one after that gap. Number 5, American meanings of democratic were rare, and they were primarily cited at the beginning of the discourse, so that's the red one. Number 6, jazz was not called democratic during the early 70s and was rarely used for a decade prior. So I justify each of these with historical backing, but I do that in my research project, in my actual paper. And so here I will move on to the broader implications of my research. My research not only uses measures the usage of democratic, but it measures the meanings too, and it fills a dearth of scholarly literature. Despite decades of media and scholarly attention, no one has questioned, deciphered, and mapped the labeling of jazz as democratic until now. But now we have a greater understanding of the malleability of media depictions. They can be swayed by current events and political pressures. The practice of calling jazz, as we know now, has very little to do with the presence of democracy. In this case, media sources have the ability to perpetuate narratives, and they do so by the people that formed them. Thank you for coming to my research project and all that jazz, and I hope you enjoy the rest. Thank you.